Okay, so in the previous video I made about Lies of P, I mentioned that Lies of P is Sekiro, but with Dark Souls bosses, and I didn't really have a way of explaining what I meant by that, but at the time I thought that that was a correct statement. And my perspective has changed a little after, trying to make this video and thinking more deeply about the differences between Lies of P and Sekiro. And actually having gone back and playing Sekiro, I know what the differences are. So, in Lies of P and Sekiro, both games have a block that, when timed correctly, turns into a parry, right? So they're both similar in that aspect. And like in Sekiro, in Lies of P, the parry is heavily incentivized, right? So they're incentivized in different ways, however. In Sekiro, parrying is incentivized due to the stagger meter, right? So you build up stagger by parrying enemies' attacks and attacking them. And that's the main way of killing bosses in Sekiro, because your weapon doesn't actually do that much damage when attacking, and this is partly due to something else, which is the fact that bosses and enemies block and parry your attacks. So most of the time, your goal is to simply just attack enough to get the enemy to attack you in response, so that way you can keep parrying their attacks and keep building up the stagger meter and staying on the offensive and never letting them back up away from you to kind of deplete their or regain their stagger, right? So you want to constantly be on the offensive in Sekiro. Now, in Lies of P, the parry is incentivized in several different ways. First, it's the only way of avoiding getting hit by fatal attacks, the red attacks that bosses do in Lies of P. Not just bosses, but enemies as well. And not only that, parrying can also break weapons, reducing the enemy's or boss's range for their attacks. And it also increases the enemy's stagger meter, which lets you do a heavy attack and then get a riposte on them while they're in a down state, right? So those are a couple of the ways that parrying is incentivized in Lies of P. Another thing is that if you get a small upgrade to the parry, whenever you parry, you can then regain a little bit of health if you've taken chip damage. There's also another upgrade that makes it so simply just parrying attacks can put them into the staggered state, so that way you can counterattack them, right? So there are ways of enhancing your parry even further. And the difference between both games is, in Sekiro, the player plays by the same rules that the bosses play by, and that's not the case in Sekiro, or in Lies of P. In Lies of P, the bosses and the player have two different rule sets that they play by. So bosses in Lies of P can't block and they can't parry. So there isn't the same kind of back and forth that happens in Sekiro, where you're fighting for advantage against the boss and you're trading attacks and they're getting blocked and parried. That kind of back and forth that happens, it doesn't exist in Lies of P, right? And so that's what I meant when I said that Lies of P is like Sekiro with Dark Souls bosses, because the bosses don't have that same kind of back and forth like in Sekiro, but parrying is still heavily incentivized, right? And it's an integral feature of the game, like it is in Sekiro. So that's why I said Lies of P is Sekiro with Dark Souls bosses. But my perspective has shifted a little bit, because now I don't think that that's quite right. I think if you look at it the way that I did originally, then I think that that statement could be, that interpretation could be correct, right? But I've kind of changed my thoughts on it, since I feel like it's a little bit reductive for what Lies of P has done, and also it's a little bit reductive for Sekiro to simply just say that oh, this game is like Sekiro because it has a parry. And it's like, well, that's not all that Sekiro did, right? It was heavily designed around the player having only a singular weapon, and it was also heavily designed around the stagger bar being the main way of, you know, dealing damage, basically. And that's just not the case for Lies of P. Lies of P is designed around having a wide variety of weapons that do damage simply because, you're attacking the boss instead of having the main source of damage be from staggers. So, I think the design elements are vastly different. And to say that Lies of P is like Sekiro because it has a parry, I feel is a little bit reductive now. And instead, I would say that Lies of P is more akin to the Soul series with some aspects mixed in from Sekiro, and of course from Software's other games like Bloodborne. Lies of P really takes a lot of inspiration from a lot of different From Software games, right? Bloodborne, Sekiro, Souls, right? Takes a lot of inspiration from those kind of games. And so, to me, I kind of disagree with what I said in the previous video a little bit, right? Because once again, I still think that you could interpret Lies of P that way, but also I feel like it's I'm trying to put it into words what I'm thinking, but I'm just kind of rambling as I go, so I don't have anything written down. But I don't know. I feel like it's a little bit strange to call Lies of P like, or to say that Lies of P is like Sekiro, with how vastly different the combat feels, and also how parrying works in Lies of P. So I feel like it's important to bring up the kind of distinctions in how the parrying works. So in Sekiro, you can't spam the block button all that fast, but the window for a block to become a parry is pretty generous. Now, in Lies of P, you can spam the block incredibly quickly, and you can move around while doing it, and it looks a bit silly at times because of how fast you can spam it. But because the parry window is so precise in Lies of P, if you try to do the same strategy of spamming the block button, even if you spam it as literally as fast as you can, you will never get a single parry if you try to approach the game that way. And that's even if you simply just held the controller in such a way that you could spam LB as fast as possible, like with your index or whatever finger is your fastest, right? If you just spam the trigger or the button as fast as you possibly could, like you're trying to mash for a quick time event or something, you'd still never get a parry. So, but that's just because of how precise the parry window is, which I feel like they could loosen that up a bit, especially since Lies of P has a lot of delayed attacks, and also there's a certain stiffness to the animations in Lies of P. The animations aren't bad necessarily, but there is a certain stiffness to them that I've noticed. And another problem that I have with Lies of P is the audio for attacks, because I feel like either the timing is off or the sound doesn't exist most of the time, or maybe it's just kind of the mixing that is happening, or certain sounds maybe get prioritized over others. Because for me, what I like to do when I'm struggling is I like to listen to what the boss is doing, so that way I can potentially try to learn the timings of the attacks and when they're going to hit by differentiating the sounds, because you can react quicker to audio than you can visual cues. So I feel like that having really good audio is very important to me, because that's one of the ways that whenever I get stuck, I rely on listening closely to the audio, so that way I can differentiate between, okay, this is the sound of the startup of the attack, this is the sound of the attack in motion, and this is when I should parry. But you can't really do that in Lies of P from my experience. There are some moves where it works. Luxacia has a move where she drags her sword on the ground, and after you hear the scraping, that's when you should parry, at least if you're using the dragon sword. That's when you want to start holding the attack button down. But for another boss, the something of illusion, it attacks with a butcher knife and just a regular knife. And the attacks are very quick, but whenever she's swinging in the air, you can't really hear the sword swings all that much. And so her animations are also really stiff, and they have very jerky movements in them as well. And so it can be hard to gauge when you should parry or block, because the audio just isn't right, and also the animations are a little bit stiff and kind of jerky. So I find that boss to be very frustrating to fight, even after the second time that I fought it, right? Because I fought it in my first playthrough, I struggled a lot. Now in my second one, I didn't struggle as much because I kind of stayed at a distance and didn't try to parry as much, and simply just dodged and used heavy attacks, right? So doing the fight that way wasn't as much of a frustration, and it didn't really take me all that many tries. But even still, whenever I did try to parry certain moves, or if I got caught in a really long combo from the boss, it was very frustrating not being able to listen for audio cues, and also just be able to easily identify what the boss is doing. Now, something that this game loves a lot is having attacks where the animation can be obscured by a different part of the boss's body, right? I think the Parade Master, one of the first bosses that you fight, has a move where the start of the swing takes place behind the enemy's back, right? And there are other bosses that do a similar thing, like they'll be positioned maybe to the side, and then they'll do an attack that's obscured because the boss is so large. Those moves are very, very frustrating if you try to parry them, right? Those moves are moves that you should dodge, and other moves where it's very easy to kind of see what the boss is doing, those are the kind of moves that you should parry. Now, in my first playthrough, I didn't think like that because I kind of foolishly thought, oh, heavily incentivized parry, this is like Sekiro. I should play it like I would play Sekiro. So I should focus on parrying and building up stagger, so that way I can, beat the bosses. But I feel like that's not a very fun way of playing Lies of P, and instead I feel like you should focus more on playing it like a Souls-like, and not playing it like you would Sekiro, because to me I just found that very frustrating. But when I played it like Dark Souls and I used like a heavier, slower weapon, I found the game to be a lot more fun. And now I haven't beat the game for my second playthrough, but I've gotten to Champion Victor, and I'm moving through the game pretty quickly now. But, and I'm having a lot more fun doing it this way. So, anyway, that's pretty much all that I wanted to say with regards to Lies of P. I think that there are things that I find problematic, things that I think they could definitely work on for the next game that they make, if it's going to be similar to Lies of P. I do like that at the very end they kind of they have a cinematic where they kind of tease maybe another entry into the Lies of P series, which seems like it could be pretty interesting if they manage to improve on the animations and the audio a little bit, because those were the two things that frustrated me the most. And another thing with regards to NPC bosses, because I think the NPC bosses in Lies of P are easily the worst part of the game, and I found that really frustrating my first playthrough, because once again I was playing it like I would Sekiro, and to me the human enemy bosses in Sekiro are some of the best fights in the game, and for the human NPC bosses in Lies of P to be the worst fights in the game was very jarring and frustrating to me, because I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting them to be really fun and interesting, and I was expecting there to be the same kind of back and forth that happens in Sekiro. But because the human NPCs can't block or parry, they just have hyper armor. That kind of combat flow doesn't exist, and you actually have to approach them differently than you would other bosses, because if you parry all of the human NPC bosses' attacks, and then you try to do a light attack of your own after they finish their combo, then chances are they're simply just going to hyper armor through the attack and then hit you in response. And so essentially you're being punished for, parrying their attacks. So instead, what I found to be the most, the easiest way of approaching them is dodge their attacks and use heavy attacks with a weapon that has a lot of range. And I found that to be a pretty easy way of handling those NPC boss fights, and I didn't find them to be nearly as frustrating the second time around. I think the Hero Sword was a very good choice for my second playthrough, because I'm having significantly more fun with that than any other weapons I tried my first playthrough. But anyway, that's enough rambling.